You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
You know, the foundation has been working in agriculture and food for over a century, and a lot of that work focused on fighting hunger and improving the productivity of smallholder farmers. When President Ruto's administration came in, we first engaged the First Lady, and she agreed to champion school meals. There's very high acceptability for some of these traditional crops, so let's be very deliberate about the opportunities for competitive local supply traditional crops. In spite of what we hear in geopolitics and the news, there does seem to be appetite for cooperation and multilateral efforts. This does signal hope.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to another episode of the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we explore the ideas, innovations, and strategies that are unlocking Africa's economic potential. Today, we're looking into something that many people still see as a social intervention, but which may actually be one of the most powerful economic levers available to African governments. That is school meals, but not just feeding programs. We're talking about food systems transformation, climate resilience, agricultural industrialization, and long-term human capital development. The Rockefeller Foundation, in partnership with the World Food Programme, the German government, and the Novo Nordisk Foundation, has just launched a $80 million School Meals Accelerator aimed at helping governments reach an additional 100 million children by 2030. Joining me today is Mehrdad Ehsani, Vice President for Food Initiatives at the Rockefeller Foundation. Mehrdad, welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Thanks for having me, Teresa.
So, Mehrdad, how are you?
It's an exciting time for us. I'm quite optimistic about our new program in school meals. So it's a good day.
Fantastic. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation. So, as always, I like to get straight into the conversation. I was thinking, let's look at a bigger picture. I know the School Meal Accelerator aims to reach an additional 100 million children by 2030, which is a very bold ambition. So what made the Rockefeller Foundation decide that now is the moment to make a $80 million bet on school meals in Africa?
Right. Well, first of all, this is a combination. It's a partnership with the German government, the World Food Programme, Novo Nordisk Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And so together we've put 80 million into this accelerator. Maybe I'll just jog a bit back in history. You know, the foundation has been working in agriculture and food for over a century. And a lot of that work focused on fighting hunger and improving the productivity of smallholder farmers, bringing to bear green revolution technologies. And while that had tremendous outcomes in helping up to 1 billion people come out of hunger, there were unattractive outcomes. You know, the food system that we have inherited is not very nutritious, it's not sustainable, it's not very inclusive. And so there was some sort of brainstorming about a decade ago in the food team about how we might be able to shift the food system towards these other outcomes as well. And so what we found is that influencing institutional procurement seemed to show a lot of promise. If you could convince governments to use the demand of school meals, being the largest institutional buyer, to shift agriculture, that would be very significant. At the same time, I think there was a lining of stars. When COVID struck, you know, most of the children in the world were kept at home, and everybody realized the devastating impact that had on child nutrition. And so at the 2021 Food Systems Summit, the School Meals Coalition was created by the countries of the world. And they decided there was a nationally led voluntary sort of commitments. And so this group of countries came together, civil society came around them, and we saw a lot of momentum. So we decided to join forces because we saw countries were making voluntary commitments, but they needed help in how to stand up their own national programs. They needed technical assistance in how to design these programs. They needed thought partners in how to finance them sustainably, and various capacities and accompaniment in executing these. So we felt like these capacities should be institutionalized, and so the accelerator was born. In fact, it was just launched in Berlin in January.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to look at the timing. Currently we're seeing international development funding decreasing globally. So this initiative almost feels counter-cyclical. So is this like a defensive move to protect gains, or something offensive in terms of to redesign development differently?
Yeah, so I think it speaks very broadly to the context that we're in. With ODA decreasing, we have to find other ways of programming that can still go after development outcomes. So I think, at one level, this is quite exciting because it's a demand and supply play to some extent, what we're pursuing. We're at one hand trying to see how we can improve nutrition security and cognitive development in children with the education outcomes and the human capital outcomes that has, but at the same time using that demand to help on the supply side as well to improve our agriculture and transform our agriculture. So I think that sort of demand-supply intervention has a higher chance of success. But what's interesting about school meals in particular is that 99% of school meals are actually covered by national budgets. Of course, when you go at low-income countries, that's very different. But the momentum has been towards nationally owned. And so we feel that this speaks to donor fatigue. If we can help governments stand up their own programs, then not only can you take care of the children, but you can take care of also creating healthy consumption patterns. You can take care of your agriculture. You can have environmental benefits and climate resilience coming in. So I think this kind of integrated programming also is more complex, but potentially more rewarding for intervention.
So to me, this feels bigger than just school meals. From what you've described, you're using school meals almost as a driver for systematic change rather than isolated interventions. So with that in mind, what would you say are some of the systematic changes that could happen on the ground?
Well, I think at one level, we need to develop new muscles because working in an integrated way across sectors is not natural. So this implies new ways of working. So at the level of government, it implies that the ministry in charge of school meals, the Ministry of Education, needs to collaborate with the Ministry of Agriculture. Ministry of Health has a role, definitely social protection and environment. But of course, ultimately, they have to convince the Ministry of Finance because the Ministry of Finance has so many proposals and how to balance expenditure on, what are called productive sectors versus what some refer to as a non-productive sector, because it takes time for children to become, to grow and to become economically active. So we feel the bundling of economically active sectors like agriculture with those of social development potentially is something that gives an acceptable return on investment that ministries of finance could accept and lenders could potentially target as well to have some kind of return. So I think that's one aspect that we hope to see on the ground is better coordination across sectors and at the government level, at the national level. But yeah, on the ground, I mean, there is already evidence, Tirsa. If you look at, let's say Kenya, where I live, Kenya instituted a school meals program in the 1980s and 90s. And it's not by chance that Kenya has the highest per capita consumption of dairy in Africa, which has led to supporting something like 2.2 million households as dairy producers. It has a relatively mature dairy processing sector. And I think it's contributed. Kenyans are known for being quite entrepreneurial. I attribute that to some extent to the school meals program, getting protein for good cognitive development. So I think what we will see on the ground is the emergence of sort of local agriculture if we use the procurement specifications to drive it towards greater nutrition, greater resilience, perhaps even regenerative practices, because in Africa, many of our soils are mined, and agriculture is the number one reason why we cut down our forests. So I think we could potentially see, an agriculture that's more sustainable, more inclusive, better opportunities for farmers and SMEs in the supply chain. And I think we will also see that our diet-related healthcare costs will begin to decline. And these are very significantly increasing and becoming a serious burden to the treasuries. But ultimately, we're going to see, our children develop physically and cognitively, and our human capital, I think, will unleash greater long-term economic outcomes. Right now in Africa, I think the World Bank estimates that sub-Saharan Africa's human capital index is about 0.4. So that means we develop something like 40% of the human capital potential of our children born today. And we can do better. And so I foresee that, with these programs, definitely more children will enter school. They will be able to learn better because hungry children don't learn. So I think we will see multi-sectoral outcomes in the years to come.
Thank you for sharing that. We know from experience that in the development space in Africa, we always see great models and theory, but execution is where these initiatives either succeed or fail. What would you say is different about this model compared to traditional donor-funded feeding programs?
Yeah, so I think one of them is the ownership by government for the fiscal responsibility for these. And of course, this has to be graduated. I don't think we can expect some low-income countries to take full ownership instantly, but there has to be some sort of graduation. I think another one that I mentioned is the integrated way that it will require departments to work with each other. This is not something that has been done previously to much success. So I think that's going to be another challenge. Of course, there are competing interests, right? I mean, governments are now, I think, in some cases, 2/3 of government expenditure is going towards servicing debt. And so to some extent, governments are being forced to choose to default on social investment rather than defaulting on debts. So I think it's going to take courage for governments to look at school meals and not see it as a reoccurring expenditure, but see it as an investment in the future of their children and of their sectors. So it is a mindset shift, I think.
Fantastic. You touched on helping governments to think through on the fiscal responsibility. So before we get to that point, how do governments apply for this funding, and also what determines who receives the support?
Yeah, so the School Meals Accelerator is launching expressions of interest. The accelerator, because it's raised about $80 million so far, should be able to accompany anywhere between 15 to 20 countries at various levels of intensity. The technical assistance and support that they receive will be it'll be demand-led. So it depends on what governments ask for. But basically, the accelerator doesn't have the capability to actually pay for the school meals. So the accelerator would be helping governments to look at the various options for financing. I mentioned a few relating to fiscal space, but we're also actively working to learn about how a bundled school meals and agriculture portfolio could become something that could attract private capital. So if you bring in capital from the markets, if you bring in concessional finance from MDBs and DFIs, if you bring in a little bit of grant funding to sweeten the deal, because the risks are initially high until we prove that these are actually workable asset class, then I think the risk profile will shift, and we can then begin to move more towards private capital and concessional capital as a blended finance mechanism to drive this kind of bundled school meals opportunities.
So if we go back to a point you made earlier regarding you're based in Nairobi, Kenya, and we've seen similar programs like that in Kenya in the past. Countries like Zambia have seen strong results from homegrown school feeding programs. What would you say specifically worked in those markets in the past?
Yeah, so I think we touched on Kenya's school milk program. I think the results speak for themselves. That's been a tremendous success. it did take a lot of courage, really, I think, to invest. And in this current climate, Kenya has committed to universal school meals. So that would be reaching about 10 million school children by 2030. This is quite a challenging fiscal problem. Currently, Kenya is in a debt swap discussions with the US, the DFC, to see how the gains from this debt swap could improve food security, which would have implications for school meals as well as the supply chains that go towards school meals and other vulnerable groups. So I think being creative on that side, being open to these kind of different financing mechanisms is very helpful. But yeah, I think, look, I think most governments will want to do this on a small scale first and see the demonstration in their local context that this actually works. But there is lots of evidence coming from many countries around the world. Shrewd politicians know that they're reaching the children of voters. And so that may be in their re-election campaigns of some politicians as well.
You highlighted there in terms of many African countries are navigating debt pressure and fiscal constraints. So how do you convince, say, a Ministry of Finance that school meals are an investment and not an expense?
Yeah, so I would use the example of Kenya. When President Ruto's administration came in, we first engaged the First Lady, and she agreed to champion school meals. So I think that sort of informal engagement was helpful. But then we also started to invest in Murang'a, one of the counties, as a showcase. The governor there showed a lot of leadership, and the president went to see how that was working, and he was very pleased with those results. We helped the Ministry of Education develop local evidence on the returns of investment, on what Kenya could do, the different pathways, the meal quality types that it could go for, what it would imply for local agriculture, for health, and so forth. And I think the evidence armed the Ministry of Education to advocate more broadly. We engaged with the government's, the president's advisors, talking through different mechanisms that they could look at for financing. In fact, they gave legal notice for a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, but industry pushed back on this, and so that was stalled. But I think we will see that it will reemerge very soon. I would say it's a process. You need many champions from different parts of government, as well as private sector and civil society. It's been helpful to have civil society advocate for this, and the press has played their role. Giving voice to communities also is important. I think working at the level of county government has also been helpful. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. It needs persistent, partnership-focused, patient partnership. And, there'll be up and downs. We have been on a roller coaster ride in Kenya. Well, hopefully we're on the up right now. But yeah, I mean, all in all, when you look at the momentum, there is reason for optimism. In the last 2 years, Africa increased school meals by 20 million children. So we are now at 80, 85, 86 million, I think. So that's a 30% increase in 2 years. That's very significant. It's the fastest actually anywhere in the world. So despite our troubles, it seems like governments have seen that this is important and this is something that we should struggle for.
So from the experience and insights you've gained in Kenya, for African governments listening to this, what are some of the practical steps you advise they should take if they want to scale school meals?
So I think it's very understandable that a Ministry of Finance will need evidence. So I think working with partners to help them generate evidence that this is not a reoccurring expenditure, that it's a good investment if designed well and multi-sectorally. And of course, the accelerator will be happy to help. So I think that's the first step. I think building goodwill, that multiple ministries can be involved and that they can achieve their outcomes related to job creation, farmer productivity, farmer income, health outcomes, and education outcomes, and so forth. I think building that broad-based coalition is important. I think the element of starting to talk to partners who would work with government financing institutions and others is an important aspect. But ultimately, I think it's important that we accompany government and not go at the pace of philanthropy or bilateral donors. At the end, this has to be nationally owned and led. And taking that posture of going at the pace of what governments feel comfortable is important. Otherwise, you find the ownership begins to shift, and then that creates unhealthy dynamics.
You've touched on some of the short-term economic effects of a well-designed national school meal program. So if we look at the long term, how would you say a school meal program will translate into productivity, workforce development, or even GDP growth?
Yeah. So one example to look at, which is interesting, is Brazil. Brazil legislated in its school meals program to ensure that 30% of the procurement for school meals had to benefit smallholder farmers and family farmers. And so this has had a really interesting effect. The latest analysis I've seen is that it increased income of family farms ranging from something like 23% to 106%. So clearly, farmers benefited from having this access to school meals channels. I think there's quite a bit of evidence also to show that institutional procurement, like school meals, has accelerated the transition towards more climate resilient food production. Our own analysis in Africa of regenerative agriculture practices, we have seen where there's improvements in soil have also translated in improvements of yield of anywhere between 68% to 300%. So I think, those kind of productive gains, these are, of course, still somewhat anecdotal, but the evidence base is growing. These are encouraging. But over the long term, there is already evidence that, when you keep school meals programs going, your attendance in school really increases. Retention and transition to secondary school really improves performance. There's evidence of performance in mathematics and English and language and other things. These all improve. And what's quite exciting is the gender dimension. It seems like girls are kept in school longer when there are school meals programs in place, and hence then they get to avoid early marriage or other sorts of challenges that may come from that. So I think there is a strong gender dimension in the human capital. But, we can also look at other countries like Indonesia. Currently, Indonesia is in the throngs of the world's fastest expansion of school meals. They have gone from under 1 million to 62 million in 1.5 years. Many people thought this wasn't possible. But when you talk to the Indonesian government, they see this as ushering in the golden age for Indonesia. They feel that this will really put their human capital on par with other countries in the Far East. In fact, they told me that they want to see the IQ of Indonesians to be the same as the Japanese. So they clearly seem to see a link between their economic transformation and these school meals programs.
Using the example of Brazil and Indonesia, you've clarified how school meals can become a strategic lever for agriculture, industrialization, economic growth. Do you believe it can be a lever for increased regional trade under frameworks such as AFTA?
Yeah, so clearly, while we promote homegrown school meals, because that has local economic development outcomes for the community and it creates political will and support from the community, which is essential, we cannot operate as islands. Given climate change, what we're going to see is shifting areas year on year where there will be a surplus or a deficit in production. This implies you need to be able to move food across borders quickly and efficiently. So I think while we promote homegrown school meals, we should not be advocating for lack of trade or any kind of tariff or non-tariff trade barriers. We need that to function well. And, in the case of Kenya, if we look at it, Kenya is not self-sufficient in food production. And while we can increase Kenya's productivity, ultimately trading with, say, Tanzania, the world's 7th largest producer of beans, makes total sense. Tanzania is a lot more efficient than we are in doing that. And Uganda is very effective also in grains and things. So there has to be that dynamic of trade. And I think AFCTA can play a positive role in that. But what I would say is we should be focusing on intra-regional trade, because that has greater knock-on effects when we trade with each other and our neighbors. When you're trading globally and unnecessarily, I think you let money go through your fingers. In Kenya, for example, we import white rice. And we do this and we supply the arid areas with it. And this creates consumption patterns for something that those communities will never be able to grow competitively. So we would advocate that we should give some attention to traditional African crops, millet, sorghum, and others that can be drought tolerant. And we already have the evidence that we have done on children's preferences, and there's very high acceptability for some of these traditional crops. So I think, yes, trade is good, but also let's be very deliberate about the opportunities for competitive local supply on specific traditional crops.
So I guess with that in mind, I'm not sure if this is something that you've looked at in terms of which local crops it could benefit or help promote in terms of growth and trade.
Yes, so we have looked at this. We did a study with a Boston consulting group last year. First of all, we wanted to see acceptability among children. So we found where millet, sorghum, and brown rice were involved, the acceptability in rural and peri-urban was around 80%. So that's really fantastic. We were quite surprised by this. In urban areas, slightly lower, but still highly positive. So that on that front, it's very exciting. I think on the front of affordability by government, that's another dimension you have to consider. We found that, for example, locally produced sorghum was cheaper than imported white rice. So the question that has to be asked is why is the government importing if the children already accept these kind of more nutritious, locally grown crops, right? That's something that they need to answer. We also have to look at the dimension of farmer profitability as well. And so we know we can't compete on rice, but sorghum and millet seems to show an opportunity. Definitely pulses and beans. There is opportunity there, especially as part of a rotational program of crops. And of course, we would never advocate for farmers only to grow food for school meals. You need to have a diversified approach, cash crops, domestic markets, if you have the opportunity, export markets as well. So this would be as part of a diversified approach of production for farmers.
So with that in mind, do you believe if designed correctly, school meal programs can accelerate regenerative agriculture adoption across Africa?
So that's the hypothesis we're testing. There is a movement towards regenerative agriculture being driven by multinational food companies. They realize that they're going to become the poster child for climate change very soon. As the world shifts from petroleum-based energy to renewable energy, food companies are going to come into focus because 30% of greenhouse gases come from the food system. So those multinational companies are already beginning to shift their supply chains towards regenerative practices, but we need very clear definitions because many of them are saying this is, yes, we're moving to regenerative, but then they don't have the metrics to back it up. So that's an area that we're investing in to make sure that if companies are saying we're moving to regenerative, they comply by certain metrics. So I think that's one positive momentum we're seeing. It remains to be seen if school meals can drive regenerative practices. Clearly, school meals can drive locally grown and regionally grown. That's a dimension. We have evidence for that. Clearly, school meals can prescribe through institutional specifications, procurement specifications, crop substitution. We have evidence of that. That's another component. I think the outlying component now is, can we actually influence farming practices so that farmers adopt regenerative practices because of the demand from school meals? And I think that's an area we're working on. We need to develop the evidence for that.
Thank you for sharing that. So if we take a few steps back and look at the origin, I believe the accelerator emerged from the School Meals Coalition of over 110 governments. So would you say this is a blueprint for a new model or more of a global cooperation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that worked for the School Meals Coalition that was created in 2021 in the Food System Summit was that it was led by the governments themselves. And it started relatively small, about 40 odd countries. Today, there's, I think, 111 or 112 countries. So I think that sort of nationally led approach is very healthy. I think the World Food Programme has done an excellent job of being the secretariat, and France, Finland, and Brazil as co-chairs have done a good job in advocating for growth and expansion here that's nationally owned. So, and then of course partners came in, right? I mean, we have, I think, something like 150 civil society organizations and philanthropies that are part of the School Meals Coalition. So to me, this kind of public-private civil society partnership is something to look at. In spite of what we hear in geopolitics and the news, there does seem to be appetite for cooperation and multilateral efforts. So to me, this does signal hope.
I guess a lot of the learnings or the urgency around this came around the COVID time, as you mentioned. So what lessons from COVID reshaped how we think about school meals as maybe critical infrastructure rather than some type of social assistance?
Yeah, so as you know, in some countries, children really fell backwards in their learning. Schools were closed. Not every country was able to run virtual programs. Where school meals had been provided, it was exceptionally difficult to try to now distribute to household level. So children really were very significantly affected by COVID in Africa. And I think this was one of the things that realizations that came out globally is that we need a concerted effort to look after children. So I think, to me, that's been one of the very clear outcomes from COVID. A learning for us in the foundation was, before COVID struck, we thought that maybe we might be able to balance and improve nutrition through improving the efficiency of supply chains. But one of the impacts we saw is that COVID really devastated the savings of low-income families. And so you couldn't expect, even if you improved the efficiency of nutritious foods, in those supply chains, families were just buying the cheapest food that was affordable. And so that forced us to pivot towards institutional procurement, because we felt like low-income families are in a very difficult space. They probably cannot afford to pay for better nutrition, but maybe we could approach governments with a value proposition that, look, we can improve your school menus in a budget-neutral way or quasi-budget-neutral way. And that's where we started to work with governments. And then it started to grow from there towards broader legal and policy frameworks and financing frameworks, because we saw the need was more than just menu engineering.
So we've explored, I guess, the origin of the program, some of the current activities happening. If we look to the future, say in the next 5 to 10 years, what role do you believe nationally integrated school meal systems will play in unlocking some of the economic potential on the continent?
Well, I think what I hope is that there will be, right now, among nutrition-funded philanthropies and development partners, there's a bit of polarization, I would say. There are those that are focused on the first 1,000 days, and of course there's a lot of merit for that focus because it has the highest evidence of big return on investment, and children are especially vulnerable in those early stages if they don't receive good nutrition. So my hope is that over the next 5 to 10 years, we can build bridges to look at children the first 8,000 days, basically not just infancy, but also adolescence until they graduate from school. So I think that's one partnership that I hope to see is rather than different messages coming to government on priorities, we just say children are important at whatever age they are, and we will accompany them, and we are driven by the children's well-being in its totality, not just one aspect of children's well-being. So that's something that I hope we will see. What I expect and hope to see also is that we will see the emergence of a new asset class for financing. We are working to develop that evidence, and we hope to show that regeneratively grown school meals can be an asset class for private sector investment that is coupled and blended with concessional finance. I think we will see on the global stage greater and greater elevation of school meals. The G7 already has decided that school meals will be one of its flagships. So that's quite exciting. So I think rather than something that falls between the cracks, because school meals traditionally, different ministries thought that it's the responsibility of different departments. But I think what we will see is it will become an integrator, and so it will be co-owned by multiple ministries. And I think that kind of integrated programming hopefully will begin to grow. In this difficult environment, it's very easy for us to kind of narrow down to our own silos in scarcity thinking and sort of just push for our own area. But I think if we work in an integrated way, we can make the money go much further. So I think that's something else that I hope and expect to see. And of course, once school-age children in primary school are largely covered, there's the bigger field of also secondary school children that also would benefit. So I think there's a lot of room for growth and improving menu quality and nutritional quality, and then making sure that we take care of the planet. How can we make sure that this kind of institutional procurement really drives farmer income, planet-friendly approaches to food production, right? And makes our food systems more resilient rather than just a few countries producing the vast majority of calories in the world. How can we diversify this risk more towards, locally and regionally grown food?
You've slightly touched on this, but I was wondering if you can go into a bit more detail in terms of how would you say the Rockefeller Foundation is positioning itself so that this accelerator becomes part of Africa's foundation, say, for food and human capital infrastructure rather than just a short-term nutrition initiative?
Well, I think the positive thing is, first of all, this is a 5-year strategy, an initial phase. So that's better than 2 or 3 years. So I'm grateful for the Rockefeller Foundation board for taking a longer term view. I would say the second thing is that we will crowd in other partners, and more partners are coming on board on the accelerator. We know that boards of other organizations are considering this, and the proof is in the pudding. As results start to come out, I expect others will come out. So no matter what happens to the Rockefeller Foundation, I see the institutional capacity and the partnerships of the School Meals Accelerator being able to go from strength to strength. So my hope is that this is a structure that is currently embryonic, but will continue to grow and show its value and attract more partnerships, both at the national and international level.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I hadn't thought about that, but off the top of my head, I think, any society is measured, its maturity is measured by how it takes care of its most vulnerable. And if you look at the data, food security is growing fastest among children in Asia and Africa. They don't have a voice. They can't defend their rights, right? So this is a particularly vulnerable group inheriting a particularly difficult future with unpayable debts, climate change, a highly polarized world, and so forth and so forth. So I think if we can embrace school meals as a society, it shows that we are maturing to that next level.
Mehrdad, that has been such a thoughtful conversation. What stands out for me is that school meals are not just about nutrition. They're about human capital formation, agricultural market creation, also climate resilience, and also economic system design. I believe if Africa gets this right, school meals will not just feed children, they have the potential to feed economies. So Mehrdad, thank you for joining us on the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Thank you, Tressa. It was lovely talking with you. Take care.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.